Okay. And okay. Good evening, everybody. This is I'm the director, Mamie Ang from the Valley Stream Library. Today we have our book club meeting, and our guest author is Matt Riordan. He wrote the book The North Line, and it was his first novel. So like to have Matt tell us a little about why he wrote this book, and then some of the questions that you might have. Um, and we're gonna start from there. Okay. So, Matt, it's yours. Like, you say this is your first novel. What were you writing before this? Why did you go into fiction?
Sure. This is my first novel. I was actually I wrote a large portion of this book living while I was living in New York City. I now live in Australia, which is why the window behind me is
Wow.
brightly lit. But at the time I wrote much of this, I was practicing law in New York City. I had in college I had done some writing and with some minor successes, a little something would get published here and there. But nothing commercially viable and nothing so ambitious as a novel. And I thought hard about trying to embark on a writing life at that point, but it just for reasons, lengthy and life intervened and I followed a different path, but I always sort of kept that ambition on the back burner. And then, oh, I don't know, in the 2000 teens someplace, I started working on this novel. And as it happens, as a college student in the late 80s and early 90s, I worked in Alaska on fishing boats. And I thought even at the time when I was up there that it was a very sort of novelistic environment and that it lent itself to the dramatic because much of what the human experience there was very raw and unfiltered. And the natural world played a much bigger part of my life than it did when I was a student. So I very much enjoyed it, and I always kind of thought there was a novel in there someplace. And so when I started thinking about writing a novel, that was the first thing that popped into my head, and that's what I started working on. And in 2019 or 20, um, probably 2019, early 2019, I got to a point where I had a draft that I thought was pretty reasonable, at which point we moved to Australia. And while we were here, I thought I would take a year from practicing law and work on finishing it and polishing it and submitting it to an agent, which, as you may know, is sort of the first step in a publishing process. You send off your work to a number of agents, the vast majority of whom do not respond to you. A handful of them do respond to you and say, no, thank you. And then if you're very lucky, one or two might say, send me the whole book. I'd like to read it, which is what happened to me, very fortunately. And then over the course of a year while I was living here and becoming licensed to practice law and engaging in other things, it kind of percolated through the publishing process and was picked up by my publisher. Hyperion Avenue, and was released in April. And so I'm now my deal is a two-book deal, and I'm currently working on book two. But the that's sort of the story of me as a writer, and the story of this book. Uh, a little bit I discussed about how I was in Alaska, and I thought that this was an area that was ripe for exploration. I also think that I wanted to write a book about, blue collar men working for a living, which is an area of in fiction which you just don't see very much. Much of what we see is, there's a lot of novels about, um, upper middle class people living in Brooklyn. And not, and I very much enjoy those, and I'm not knocking it, but it seemed to me that there was a particular kind of struggle in America where the stakes were very high, and people doing difficult work and learning things about themselves and the world in the process, many of those things being not very pleasant, and that they happened among blue collar people who really weren't, you know, protagonists, certainly not in the novels that I ran across. Maybe my fault, maybe I wasn't looking hard enough. But anyway, that was part of what I wanted to capture. And I also think that it has this book sort of lands amid it's set in the early 1990s, but it kind of lands in the middle of a cultural divide, which has subsequently become much starker in our country. And that, and this guy is sort of right in the middle of that without really being on either side and sort of observing both tribes while he's struggling to sort of form his own identity. And then I think, what I was trying to say was that he ultimately becomes um, something of a monster. And the question is, did he become that monster because of the environment that he lived in and what happened to him, or was he that monster all along? And it just took these circumstances to reveal that to himself and to the reader. So that's basically the 25-cent version of this novel.
Well, I have to say, you chose the ship fishing thing, and the detail of all your experiences sound very realistic. So it all came through, whatever your past experience was. Yeah, it was very raw.
Well, yeah, a lot of those experiences were based on things that I either witnessed or, experienced. Naturally, that the character is not me. Um, I always I always feel obligated to say that. I never killed anybody. I didn't engage in those activities. However, I was in some circumstances that were similar to that. I saw some bears, I saw some whales, I worked with some bad people, some good people, I saw some bad weather, and certainly those experiences informed the book. It would be difficult, I think, for me anyway. There's the old maxim that a writer, you should, write what you know. And sometimes that I think that makes sense. But then, I often read a book I'm working on a book right now that's set in the 1930s. Obviously, I have no idea. I never lived in the 1930s, but I've seen a lot of great novels that were set in times when the author didn't live. So there's limits to that advice. But for example, if I were going to write a novel about, what it was like to be an airline pilot or something, I mean, I wouldn't have the first idea. So it wouldn't sound very good. I mean, imagine you're going to work in the morning and you're an airline pilot, you drive to the airport. Well, where do you park? I don't know. I bet the pilots have some kind of special lot, probably, but I don't know that. And then they probably have some special room where they hang out before they get on the plane. Or maybe they have to go through a checklist, or maybe they have to check in, or maybe they have to talk. I mean, there's probably all kinds of procedures and things which, if you were a pilot and you wrote a book about it, you could make it very intriguing and interesting and realistic. But if you're me, it all sounds ridiculous, and then you get in the plane and how do you start it? I don't know. Do you put a key in it? Probably not. But so for me, the writing about living on a fishing boat was it was comfortable for me, and it was someplace where I thought, I could easily paint that picture.
Hi, Lorraine. Um, the there to me there was I don't know if you mentioned, there was like kind of the whole thing about the regulations and the environment. Were those things that you brought in because of your extended background in the law, or do you think that people who are in the industry are that concerned about that?
Well, that I ran into this was some time ago, but I went up there with a very sort of environmental sensibility. Um, and the people I ran into were sort of all over the road. I mean, there were many of them who were fishermen who, they realized that their livelihood depended upon the health of the environment. And so they were protective of the environment. I mean, like many people, that I think they were protective of the environment as far as somebody else's use of it. So if some other, some oil company, those were the bad guys, or some mining company that wanted to build a mine, those are the bad guys. But then those same fishermen were doing things that, that indefensible. So it kind of depended, but the general sense of, the people that I met fishing in Alaska were of a very independent streak. And they largely wanted to be left to their own devices, and they were looking for ways to skirt around the rules of the law, but by and large stayed within it, right up to the edge of what was permissible. I think, that was their financial incentive.
Yeah.
The name of the book, The North Line, is a boundary in a particular place in Alaska, and it's the line up to which you can fish, and you can't fish on the other side of that line. And it's a somewhat arbitrary line driven, determined by the state of Alaska. This again is going back 20 years. For all I know, those boundaries don't exist anymore. Or they've been altered. But at the time, anyway, or more than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it was routine that you would get tickets for fishing on the wrong side of that line because the tidal current was coming over the line. So the idea was that if you set your net and you were the first in line, all the fish are swimming one direction. So if you were the first in line, you would catch, an enormous amount of fish. And if you were second in line, you might catch, next dramatically less. So, but this current was flowing. So as soon as you set your net, you started to float over the line. Somebody would set in front of you. So there was an incentive, to set a little bit further over the line each time, knowing that you would drift back over it into legal territory. So there was, an ongoing sort of rodeo around this line with people setting nets in front of it. And I remember sitting on the deck and watching. And then I was actually on a boat once, as I recall, where we were ticketed for fishing on the wrong side of the line.
Now, I don't know, I got the sense that you're in Alaska. These are not native Alaskan fishermen.
That's right. There were my personal experience was I actually worked on boats where there were native Alaskans, everybody except me. Um, but and I thought about writing about that relationship a little bit, but frankly, that kind of stuff is so fraught with, somebody says you wrote the wrong thing or you used the wrong word or whatever. It's just easier not to get into it at all. But there was, I thought culturally, I mean, one of the things I was trying to talk about was the stark difference from this kid's life in a university on the East Coast to what it was like to drop into a difficult place full of blue collar men struggling to make a living, kind of on the knife edge of success or failure, and how their livelihoods were sort of hanging in the balance on all kinds of capricious things like the weather, um, and how they responded and the way they talked. I mean, you might have noticed there's a great deal of profanity, but that was, that's the way people spoke, and it would be a little bit weird. And if I didn't include that, and I also thought, the way people reference race in that part of the world at that time was, I mean, it would if I committed it to paper, there would be uh it would not have gotten anywhere. What I routinely saw and heard. So I tried to be, I suggested it a little bit without getting into it too much. And I thought, earlier versions of it, I explored it a little more, but it was just too radioactive. And, maybe too much, maybe the subject for another book, maybe it would have been biting off too much to chew all in one thing. But I did, I do remember specifically the sort of consciousness of all sorts of subtle political gradations of, identity that were very much under a microscope when I was in college. And then I went to Alaska and I worked with all these blue collar guys who routinely used racial slurs all the time. Everybody did. And there were parts of the equipment that were referred to with a racial slur. Like that is the blank, which and if you didn't use that word, people didn't know what you were talking about. So if you tried to, there is, for example, a piece of power equipment that the name for it at the time anyway was a racial slur. And when I tried to call it a power winch instead, because I was trying to be, whatever, doing my missionary work or so I thought, that the everyone looked at me like, what the hell are you talking about? What is that? And they were like, listen, you can't go around inventing new names for equipment because we're using all this stuff under heavy pressure in storms. Somebody's going to get killed if you don't know what you're talking about. So you have to use the word that we all use, or else bad things will happen. So you're kind of in this position where you had to sort of, and I remember thinking at the time, and you know, it wasn't as these people were expressing some sort of racial animus. It's just they just took it for granted that that was the world they lived in and everybody talked that way. but I thought, in the course of writing this book, that in the first versions, first few drafts, there was more of that, and discussions of like the relationship between the outside fishermen and the native Alaskans, and the sort of, you know, routine racial slur usage and stuff. And I just sort of decided it was probably, it would stop the reader cold. If you read that, you would stop and pick your head up and be like, what is this about? And I thought, the price of that didn't make sense.
Well, if you were concentrating on Adam and you said the change from him going, as you say, like a kind of I don't know if he would say entitled, but when went to Alaska, I'm sure some of those people would have thought of him as being an entitled, uh, semi-wealthy, rich, kind of guy. Who probably never did anything with his hands, any real work, So that would have detracted it if you tried to throw in something that has to do with Native Americans and that. Yeah, you had to stay on course.
Yeah, it would have been a little bit. I mean, plus that, I don't know enough about those issues. I mean, you drop into Alaska for a few months and you recognize that there's a large native community, many of whom work in fishing, and there's a large white community. And at the time, anyway, that it wasn't as if it was segregated, but there was, it, and I mean, I didn't know enough about it so that I should be writing books about it. I wouldn't have felt comfortable because I wouldn't have known what was true and what was not. And I just wouldn't have been able to explore that, I think, with any competence. So I decided not to get into it.
Does anyone else have any comments? I don't want to, like.
Uh, your book is really a premier law student's book. Did you finally become a lawyer?
I did, yes.
And I assume that you've left the law.
Well, not entirely. I mean, I'm a licensed lawyer here in Australia now, and I still do some legal work, but I don't work in a firm. I do it on a kind of a uh, independent basis.
That's the only way you could write a book
That's
and
right.
practice law at the same time.
I I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
Irving
last.
is a retired lawyer. So,
Ah,
Irving,
And
did you ever have any thoughts about writing a book?
my wife looked at it and said, my friends would not appreciate it. The problem with writing is you bring in your experiences that you have in life to also from what you imagine. But the difficulty with that is there's a few things that you can't do, like give up somebody's privileges. And you don't know, even though the work was even tried, the case was tried, how much didn't come out in the trials as you really do know, and you're revealing some of the competences of the people you dealt with. So that's a very difficult thing for me to sit down and adjust with him. And I think as I was reading this, I could see that he had a good legal training. I was thinking maybe he taught contract law in the first year for students and how to get it done. And he was using the fish as well, anyway, it's a new life, and I'm now a reader, not a writer. I
well,
tried too
I
many
am.
pieces.
I'm a reader myself. I probably spend more time reading than I do writing.
So what type of law did you practice then? It was not in like corporate law or environmental, obviously not those.
No, I was a litigator in the city for 20 years, and I think at one point or another, a lot of sort of run-of-the-mill commercial litigation of every variety, everything from, contracts that went bad, finance deals that went bad, real estate disputes. And then towards the end of my career, I I began to specialize in trust and estate litigation in the surrogates courts. So
Not
I
very
did a lot of
excited.
that as well.
Not very excited.
You
Found
know,
writing more exciting.
I'm sorry.
You found writing more exciting.
Sometimes, I mean, I enjoyed a good courtroom fight, but 20 years of it, it was getting a little bit. I had sort of you begin to see the same patterns over and over again. And I had always wanted to write a novel, and I thought, if not now, when? And I worked on it, and then when I submitted it and I got some interest, I was pleasantly surprised.
Well, I have to tell you, I've been choosing books for the book club for now almost 4 years since COVID. We've been doing a lot of Zooms, and we sometimes we get authors to come in. But the reason why your book struck me was that we've done so many books that are more favorable to women, like the typical women book. I said, oh, this will be a difference. And Irving is our only male reader in this group. So I said, well, let's try something totally different. And it was very different from our normal fantasy, or not necessarily fantasy, um, thriller, a lot of women protagonists. So this was totally very, very different. I, we like to mix it up.
Sure. Yeah, that there are not a lot of female characters in this book. And those that are make only brief appearances. And that was based not out of any particular desire. Well, I shouldn't say. I mean, I did want to write about blue collar men and the way that they interacted, and I thought a story about them was what I wanted to write about. Um, I'm subsequent books have that I've written have much more of a female presence, but it would be weird that it wasn't that there were no women on fishing boats in Alaska. There may well be many, many more now, but at the time it was a pretty extreme rarity. So it would have been strange to suddenly write a book about working on fishing boats, at least from my perspective, that included a lot of female characters, because that's not what I saw. Now, having said that, I could see where that would be a good book. If there was a book about a woman who's working in a fishing boat in Alaska, that would probably, I can see a lot of angles where that would be interesting, although I'm not the person to write that book.
Well, you did have, what was her name? Betsy was like the catalyst. She was a
That's
female.
right.
She was the the person who made the connections for him. So otherwise, Adam would have been in Alaska.
That's right.
Now, what brought you to Alaska and how you ended up fishing?
That's a good question. I didn't have a real good reason, but I was going to school. I went to Tufts in Massachusetts, and so I was finishing up, I think, my junior year, and a lot of the students there, and certainly many of my friends, were arranging for various internships over the course of the summer where they would go work in an office someplace. And I was an English major, and I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I just sort of thought that didn't sound very interesting. That I was going to make copies and fetch coffee and like learn about how to work in an office for the rest of my life. And I thought, geez, here I am, a young man, I'm healthy, I can go do something, and that just seems really dull. And I really didn't want to do it. And so I I remember at the time, as I recall, I want to say it was Red Lobster, but I could be wrong. But there was some seafood company or or fish company that was running advertisements on television at the time. And I remember thinking, I saw this advertisement and there were these guys on this fishing boat and they were heading out, and I was like, now that looks interesting. And at the time, it was also the case that there would be little advertisements in the Tufts Daily, which I subsequently learned were for uh, cannery line jobs for the seafood canneries. But it said like, come and work in Alaska in the fishing industry or whatever, high pay. And so I thought, that sounds like an adventure. Why don't I look into it? And then I ended up going up there on my own without a job and finding my way onto a boat, which was, very fortuitous. Generally speaking, greenhorns don't get hired onto boats, or at least it's very difficult. I kind of lucked into it. So um, that's how I ended up there. It was largely because I didn't want to go work in an office, at least any earlier than I had to.
Yes, sir, I'm on the book club. I'm on the book club.
It's his wife.
I'll read it later.
So your experiences as being like the greenhorn then did translate into the book, basically, how you your first encounters with people, not knowing, you say, not knowing the lingo and everything. Were they
Yes.
hard on you though?
They were. Well, the very first boat I worked on was a really tremendous experience for me. I worked on this boat where the captain and his crew were all native Alaskans from the Bristol Bay area. And I kind of lucked into that job. I didn't realize that, I didn't know anything I just walked into the boatyard and started asking around. And this guy was like, actually, I need a guy. You'll do. I think he was scraping the bottom of the barrel. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken me. He just needed a warm body. But they took me. So I went along, and at the time, we were fishing for herring. And the way that the herring fishery worked at the time is it was a couple of days steam from the harbor to where the herring were. So you had to, and the herring could show up at any time over like a 4 or 5 week stretch. And if they got there early and you weren't there yet, you were out of luck.
Mhm.
So you had to get there, as early as they had ever shown up to be sure you were in place and ready to go. But then the fish might show up at the latest they'd ever been there. So you could conceivably be sitting around for 3 or 4 weeks on a boat, which is what happened to us. So as I recall, this was years ago, and the first job I had, I got on this boat with these guys who I just met, and we steamed out of port. We went up to this place, and then we sat around for 3 weeks waiting for the fish to show up. And we're, living on a 32-foot boat, 4 guys. And we were, and we tied up with a bunch of other fishing boats. And it was kind of like, I had a great time. I mean, we went ashore all the time on these skiffs, and they taught me all this stuff about the local fish and I grew up hunting and fishing. So this was, I was in Alaska is probably the best place to be a hunter and a fisherman anywhere you could ever ask for. And there was all kinds of stuff and animals I hadn't seen before, and bears and whales and fish and clams and all kinds of things that I didn't know anything about that they taught me about. So I had a fantastic time. And so my greenhorn experience, my subsequent first year experiences were pretty tough, but that first few weeks, it was hard work, but I really enjoyed it.
Did you ever go back again or no? That
I
was
did. I ended up doing it for 3 years. The last time I went, I got a job working on a tender, and we left, I got up there in like early part of the year, January, February, something like that. And I started out in Cordova, which is in Prince William Sound. And it was, heavy, heavy snow every day and getting the boat ready. And then we left, I don't remember when, but sometime early in the year. And I stayed on the boat all the way through August. So I was on the boat for 8 months. And at the end of 8 months, I was pretty well cured.
Not only that, you're in the snow in the dark.
That's right.
Oh my God.
I enjoyed it though. I mean, I don't want to say that it was like constantly grim. I mean, there were parts of it, the rough weather, you get out on a boat for a long period of time, sooner or later it catches up with you. But you also get kind of used to it. So this weather that would have been frightening to me on day one, by the time you'd been out there for 3 or 4 months, it was just sort of annoying because you couldn't make coffee.
You didn't go back after you became a lawyer, though.
No, I have never been. The last time I was in Alaska was 1995. I left Alaska in August of 1995, and I went immediately into law school. I was only back for, less than a week, and I went from my house in Michigan to my law school in Indiana.
Well, you were saying how the 8 months almost, like the astronauts now, they're stuck in space now. They've got like an 8 month, like,
Mm-hmm.
um, whatever, sort of enforced visit up in space. And they can't come back.
Yeah, it was a long time to be on a boat. Plus, in the tendering, which was a different part of it, that's where we would take the fish from the small catcher boats, and then we would load them into tanks on the deck and then deliver them. We were on a charter from a bigger seafood company, and sometimes that meant we would run them offshore and pump them off to a factory ship. Sometimes that meant that we would take them to a processor facility on shore someplace, a cannery or what have you. And and in the early part of the season, it was herring, and then as the season wore on, it would be red salmon in Bristol Bay, and then it would be so the boat moved around quite a bit, and but we were never actually catching fish. We were taking fish from nets and putting them in tanks and moving them someplace else. So I missed the actual fishing part of it. So the last one, and being at sea for 8 months was a long time. And that was pre-cell phone and pre-internet. So I didn't have any connection with the outside. I was still getting letters written on paper. I think that was sort of the end of that for me.
That's now. Now you're in Australia, and I mean, do they have a fishing industry there, or
Oh, sure.
yeah? But it would probably be totally a different kind of atmosphere, because you wouldn't have the cold and that whole environmental issue.
Well, it's I don't know anything. I've never worked in fishing in Australia, but they're Australia's a big country, so very much like the U.S. It's roughly the same size as the lower 48. Um,
Hmm.
so the northern part of it is like tropical jungles with saltwater crocodiles and coral reefs but then the southern part of it, down at the southern tip of Tasmania in the Southern Ocean, when I've been down there, it kind of looks like it reminded me of maritime Canada. It would be like being in Maine or Nova Scotia or something. So it's not all balmy weather. Certainly not in the wintertime. It's winter right now, by the way.
It's hard to imagine right now. But so you're saying the north part is the warmer part, and the south, so it's like kind of opposite what we would expect here in North America.
That's exactly right. I mean, the closer you are to the equator, the warmer it is. So since we're in the southern hemisphere, as you go north, it gets warmer, and as you go south, it gets colder, generally.
That's
What will be your subject for your next book?
Well, I wrote a sort of a legal thriller kind of book that is sitting in a desk drawer that I'm going to work some more on. That's set in New York in like 2016. And then I've written a book about bootlegging in the Great Lakes in the 1930s in Michigan, that in the 20s and 30s, and that I'm working on now. I'm actually in the course of one of my rewrites, and my editor is expecting it, like last week.
Well, the bookmaking book sounds more exciting. I think I would keep the book on the legal field in the desk.
Well, we'll see.
well, also, don't you feel that, like I would say one of the most successful lawyers, like John Grisham, don't you feel that that's like could stymie your creativity? Like, do I have to compete? Like he's there. Are you competing with him, or would you have to worry about um taking his, like, taking his ideas or something like that? I would say that that would be something that would discourage me from trying to go into the field where someone has been so successful.
No,
No.
I never think about that kind of thing. I mean, if I don't think about any of the sort of published marketing. I don't think about any of that stuff. I mean, I just write the book that I think I want to write, that I think I can write, that for whatever reason, you sit down and you start thinking about a book and for me, it's often the case that I start thinking about characters and I start working out the book. And then, by the time I'm at the end, the character that I thought I was writing about turns out to be something a little different. So, part of the rewrites are matching up the character that I had at the end of the book with the one I had at the beginning of the book. They change over the course of the book, of course, but I don't often, it's often the case that by the end, the story is a little different than I thought it was when I started. So, a part of the process of rewrites is to make it all match up properly. But I don't concern myself with what other people have written generally.
But when you said you sent your manuscript out, didn't they, um, you sent them an outline only, and then they're okay that you might have changed it so drastically?
Well, I wouldn't, by the time I sent it out to them, I had already done all of that work. So, and also when you send out every agent has their own requirements, but it's not uncommon for them to ask, something along the lines of, if they accept general submissions. And, I'm sure that every agent in New York has some giant pile of submissions that comes in the door every day. And, much of it is terrible. And they probably, like the lowest tier employee, has to sift through and hope that they find something readable in this huge pile of stuff. And, by the time I had done that, I had already written rewritten it many times and polished it as much as I could so that I thought it was ready. Naturally it wasn't. And both my agent had suggestions and then my editor at my publisher, we went through it many more times. So that process is sort of ongoing. But I had gotten it most of the way there by the time I submitted it. And most of what happens is you send a small portion to an agent, like the first 10 pages or something like that, first couple chapters. They all have different sort of requirements, and they usually put that on their web page or they publish it or whatever. And then you submit that to them, and if then they like that, based on the strength of that, they would then say, please send me the whole book to read. At least that's what happened to me.
But from what you said, your timeline, this came pretty quick. You said you were 2019 or something, 2020.
Yeah, I think I started in earnest writing this book. I mean, I might have written a scene here and a scene there, like sitting in court waiting for my case to be called, writing on my yellow pad. I might have jotted down like a few lines of dialogue and gotten kind of an idea. And but when I really started putting it together in earnest was like 2018 or thereabouts, 2017 maybe. And then when we moved to Australia, my plan was that I was going to take a year off. And I thought that while I was doing that, among other things, I wanted to try and get this finished and take a real run at getting it published. So I finished it in like, I don't know. And I started sending it around to agents in like 2019, 2020 maybe. And I got an agent, by the close of, I believe, 2020. And then it didn't get picked up by a publisher until like 2022. And in the interim, I went, my agent had suggestions and, I went through a couple of edits.
What made you move to Australia?
Uh, we had just we'd been living in the city for 20 years, and I'm a big fan of New York City and love to go back there whenever I can. But I have 3 kids, and I kind of thought it would be fun if we could figure out a way. We had always sort of entertained this daydream of, wouldn't it be fun to live outside the US as expats for a few years, just for fun? And we didn't have any particular location even picked out. We would go on vacation someplace and be like, wow, what if we just lived here for a year? The sort of idle chit chat. And then in 2019, my wife's job, an opportunity to actually do it popped up. So we talked about it for a while and we thought, you know what, let's do it. We'll do it for a year and we'll see what happens. And, if we'll go from there. So we moved to Sydney. We actually live in a little town a little bit north of Sydney. And we got here, and then we got here in 2019. Then, of course, in 2020, COVID hits, and the moving back to New York City in the middle of all that was not very appealing. So, especially since there really wasn't any COVID here at the time. The way the Australians dealt with it was they just sealed the borders and said, we're nobody in, nobody out. Anybody comes into the country, you have to go through 2 weeks of quarantine. So they basically they were pretty successful at stopping it from going anywhere. And then they said, we will reopen it. Once the vaccine came out, they said, we will reopen the country by degree, depending on how much, what of the population gets vaccinated. So when the vaccination level got to 50%, they relaxed some of the restrictions and so on until the vaccination rate got to like 80% or something. And at that point, they said, okay, we're just going to take off all restrictions. That's basically what happened. There's some, finer points in there with different regions in the country or so whatever. But in the meantime, for like a year, more than that, you couldn't leave unless you had, you couldn't get in and out of the country without petitioning the government. And because there were so few people coming in and out of the country, it didn't make sense for the airlines to have the flights. So even if you did, it was extremely expensive to get out of here. So basically, we were in Australia and living in this COVID-free bubble. So at that point, we just decided, well, we may as well stay. And my kids got involved in the school, and my son he speaks with an Australian accent, and he plays rugby. And my daughter's got friends, and the path to citizenship here, is in permanent residency was pretty straightforward. So we thought, well, we'll stay for a while and see what happens. And that was now, it'll be 5 years in September. I'm, I never say never. I don't know what our plans are going to be for the future, but for right now, we're not going anywhere.
Do you have dual citizenship?
I
Do
do.
you have, yeah, you don't have to give up United States.
No.
Well, I believe that Australia and New Zealand, they had women like presidents at the time when the COVID hit.
The New Zealand did.
New
Australia
Zealand.
did not.
And she was very very firm of not letting any COVID come into the country. So they were, I think, one of the safest countries at that time. Not like the United States.
Yeah, it was their approach to it. I think, on the scale of some countries that handled it very well and some that handled it very poorly. That Australia and particularly New Zealand, I think, came out of it, less damaged than many other places. And there wasn't this weak wake in that, all these people who hated each other based on whether or not they had to like wear masks and stuff. We didn't really have that. Only a very little bit. So largely people just sort of said, okay, this is what we got to do. Let's do it until this passes. They did it. It passed. We went back to life as normal. That's basically, it wasn't that exciting a story. And in the meantime, while we were here, it was a lovely place to be stuck. It's a beach town, and I learned to surf poorly, but I did it.
Well, if you gone and stuck someplace, you picked a good place to get stuck, I guess. Well,
Yeah, that was just luck, but that's the way it worked out. So yes, COVID, we came to Australia with sort of an idea of without any real sense of how long we were going to be here. And then COVID kind of made that decision for us. And then by the time we could get in and out of the country easily, we had sort of, roots had naturally developed here.
I'd like to bring back the conversation to the North Line.
That's a good idea.
I really enjoyed the pacing of this book. The chapters were short and it was a page turner. I normally would never pick something like this for myself, but I am very grateful to be a part of this book club because that's what book clubs do. They select books that you would not normally select for yourself. And I could not put it down. This was something, it was very different to me. But I didn't understand something about Adam.
Sure.
Adam was a college student, but he didn't really seem to be very academically minded. He didn't seem to really care about his classes, yet he was motivated to make money so that he could go back and get his degree. So what were your
Why not?
thoughts behind that, that you created this character who was so motivated to finish college, and yet, like, why wouldn't he just, he could have done this as an occupation, like for, the next 5 years and drop out.
Well, at the
Well,
beginning, they do, actually, that's addressed where he's really striving to get out of his situation in the town he's from in Ohio, because he realizes that it's limited the opportunity in life he could have there. And he believes that college is his ticket for improving in a better life.
No, I saw that. I just, getting phone calls. I just like it. I don't know. This was just not that type of kid who really, who really need, his whole point was to make money. And I don't think he cared that much whether it was through a college degree or without a college degree, how he could make, a decent living for himself, or he can elevate his standard of living.
well, what I was trying to, I think you're right about that. I mean, he's not, he certainly wasn't interested in college because he wanted to become an educated person. That was really sort of not his interest. He saw going to college as a ticket out of um, the life that was otherwise waiting for him. You know, and that when he got to Alaska, he thought, I have to do this because if I don't get the money to get that degree, I'm going to fall back into the clutches of this town or some that I grew up in or someplace like it, with this sort of full of these miserable, belly achers who the reason that they're down on their luck is always somebody else's fault and they don't do anything to better themselves or whatever. And he's sort of a striver, but that doesn't mean that he's particularly interested in, you know, what the knowledge that a university might bestow on him. He's really interested in it as kind of a transactional thing. He views it as his pass into a better life and his pass into the part of America that he wants to be in. And whether he learns anything or not, he really doesn't care, or at least only minimally. And then when he gets to Alaska, I think one of the things that he he sort of finds his tribe a little bit. He finds the people that he grew up with. Again, he's not interested in them. They sort of are they blame anybody but themselves for their lot in life, and they don't have much in the way of ambition, and they don't and they're bitter and resentful and suspicious of outsiders. And then when he gets to college, he finds these kids who are all sort of, born to that life. And, they grew up in some nice suburb with, well-heeled parents, and they go to this fancy school and they don't think about risk, and they don't think about the stakes for them are very low. I think at one point he talks about how they couldn't fail if they tried, that the world was set up for them so that, they were always going to come out on top. And when he sees that, he thinks to himself, well, that's where I've got to be. I got to figure out a way to get from where I am to where they are. But then he goes to Alaska, and he has some degree of contempt for both of those groups of people. And when he gets to Alaska, he finds these people who don't live like that. They don't live like either of those people, that they put their whole lives on the scale and take huge risks and do this dashing stuff that's physically dangerous and exciting and fun, and they might end up dead and they might end up rich. And he thinks to himself, like, this is a really fascinating way to live. And that's what I was trying to do anyway.
Well, you did it.
Huh.
You did it. I saw it all through the book, exactly what you're talking about and why you did it.
Do you think
Well,
that, like, you said that you went back a couple of years? Once Adam left, do you think he would ever have gone back to Alaska?
I don't know. I've been asked by a number of people in other book club meetings whether I would write another book with him as the character, him later in life, and what does he end up doing? And, is he now sort of a psychopath or then that's a good question. I haven't thought that through. I don't know where he would go. And I'm not sure what his thoughts would be, a week after we left him, when he was back on dry land and safe, and if everything goes to his plan, he's not in the custody of the authorities and he's got a bag full of money. I'm not sure what he's thinking. That's a good question. And maybe that's the subject of another book.
It's a great book because he'll never get out of jail once he gets back, because that's where he ends up eventually. If he continues in the vein of your book, he's not going back to become a lawyer. He's coming back to make money, whether as an entrepreneur or whatnot, and he'll take the risk.
Well, I see that this little bit of theme of your next book. Then the bootleggers, they were looking for money, sort of maybe on the skirts of the law.
That's true. Although the second book is much more of a family drama, and it's kind of a saga of a family over like a 5 or 6 year period in the Depression and Prohibition.
Well, okay. Well, we're almost at our hour. So when do you think that that's going to be published, or you're not far enough along yet?
I think that the current schedule is for sometime in the middle of next year. So like, and in publishing, whatever dates they give you always get pushed back. So it's like the completion date of a government project. Whenever they tell you a bridge is going to be built, it's always a year later. This is sort of like that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I could see how you would have all that illegal liquor coming through Canada, through the Upper Peninsula.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what it's about. It's about, and the family lore in my family. I grew up in that part of Michigan, and I don't know if this is true. So I would never say this is based on a true story or even informed by actual events. This is things that I think I heard when I was a little boy, said by people who have been dead for 15 or 20 years. So that's the degree and the number of levels from the truth, what I am about to say is. So, which is to say, well, may well be completely nonsense, but that my family was supposedly involved at some point, and they were in commercial fishermen in the Great Lakes, and that sometime along during the 1920s and 30s, that an ancestor of mine figured out that he could make more money selling whiskey than he could selling herring. So, and he already had the boat. So all he had to do was go the rest of the way across the border, because the Canadians could manufacture alcohol so long as it was for
Medicinal.
export. So so like the big refineries and distilleries and breweries in Canada were churning out booze, and they were selling it across the border into the U.S. market illegally. They were sort of the cartel of the 1930s. So the story is about a family that gets involved in that trade and the various things that happen to them.
Sounds very interesting. We'll have to
Well,
keep an eye on for it.
What town in Michigan?
Well, the town in the book is a fictional town that I made up, but the town that I grew up in was called Lexington, which is about the town. The nearest town of any size is a town called Port Huron, which is on the sort of where the lake necks down into the St. Clair River. There's Port Huron on one side and Sarnia on the other side of the border, and I was about 20 or so miles north of that.
Oh, okay, because I'm a Spartan mom.
Ah,
So I've been to Michigan quite a few times, but only the lower part of the mitten.
that's right. Well, the book that I'm working on now, lots of it takes place in Lansing.
Oh, okay. Well, that's where we lived. Yeah. No, well.
Well, I want to thank you, Matt, for coming. What time is it in Australia there?
It is now about 10:30 in the morning.
Oh, because that's not so bad.
No, it was
No.
very civilized time. Occasionally I have conference calls and I have to get up at some ungodly hour, and my wife does too, but this is very civilized. And I'm very grateful to all of you for having read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you
No,
for
hope you
thank
enjoyed
you
it.
for the book.
Yeah.
The book was
My pleasure.
very entertaining.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank
And
you.
we'll be looking for your next book then. Okay.
Thank you.